Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Can You See Me, formerly known as Can You Hear Me podcast. And we have got a massively bumper edition for you today. So much so that we've actually extended the podcast. So I hope that you're sitting comfortably while you're watching or listening to this, because it's probably going to be the most popular and interesting podcast that we've done for a while. Why, I hear you cry? Because it's all the secrets that you always wanted to know and were too scared to ask about non-executive recruitment. What is non-executive recruitment? How do you do it? How do you get on there? And what are the secrets of being a successful non-executive? Well, I have got some of the most influential players in the game on this podcast, and I'm going to introduce them all to you right here, right now. So firstly, Farah, what's your name? And Asila Black says, where are you from?
Thanks very much, Fatima. My name's Farah Jameel. I'm a GP based up in London. I work across North Central London, and I'm a non-executive director at Barnet, Enfield, Haringey Mental Health Trust, part of the North London Mental Health Partnership. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. I mean, as you know, the Can You See Me, Can You Hear Me podcast is not only a national but international podcast, and we're growing all the time. Peter, where are you dialing in from today?
Hello, I'm dialing in from Yorkshire. I'm Chief Executive of Yorkshire Ambulance Service, and I'm also co-chair of the Disabled NHS Directors Network. And although I'm not a non-executive director, I've spent about 30 years on NHS boards working with many non-executive directors. So I've got a bit of experience of working with NEDs.
Certainly have, and we really appreciate you joining us, particularly at a time when the Yorkshire Ambulance Service is really busy. So thank you for dialing in. Marie.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I'm Marie Burnham. I would say I'm a seasoned non-executive director, if you like. Been chairing now for a number of years. I'm part of the South West Yorkshire Foundation Trust, which is mental health and community. I love the role, and it's a real pleasure to be here today and share my experiences. So thank you.
And thank you. I think what we're already starting to see from the people that we've got on the panel is the amazing range of experience. We don't just have your usual standard non-executive directors. We've got people that have worked as executives, that have transitioned into non-executive directors. And we also have the perspective of an executive leader and how we work alongside non-exec. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. And one of the most interesting ladies that I've ever met is Cathy Elliott. Cathy, if people have been under a rock, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you for bringing us all together. So hello, my name's Cathy Elliott. I am chair of NHS West Yorkshire Integrated Care Board, ICB, and I'm deputy chair of our Health and Care Partnership. And similar yet different to Marie, I've been a non-exec on boards for a little while now in the NHS. I've been chair of Bradford District Care. I've been a non-exec in the Greater Manchester system. And I have a background in voluntary sector and social policy. I've been trustee of national charities. I've been a chief exec of a regional charity. And I suppose, Fatima, in some ways, I'm an example of how you don't have to have come from the NHS of many years. That I am an example of diverse thinking that can be brought in at board levels. So thank you for bringing us together today. As you know, we're working hard in West Yorkshire to make sure that we are bringing in the breadth and depth of experience onto our 11 provider boards and our ICB and our place committees, and we're working hard to make sure we've got diversity of thinking and representation. So this is a great podcast and to be involved in today. Thanks.
Thank you. And we are going to explore a little bit about the fact that you don't need to be an NHS well-learned individual to come and play in the health and care system. Now, Robin, you are probably one of the most influential people when it comes to non-executive recruitment. And the reason why I say that is because every time I see recruitment, it's usually got the sign of GatenbySanderson on it. So you clearly are well-versed in non-executive recruitment. But if people haven't heard the name or of you, do you want to just say a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Fatima, and thank you so much for inviting me on this. I feel I'm very, whether I'm influential, I'm not sure. I'm certainly involved, is probably the word I'd use. So GatenbySanderson works right across the public sector. I lead the health team. I'm calling in from Yorkshire, but we work nationally across the whole of the country. And with non-executives in mind, we're involved with ICBs and with provider trusts in helping them to identify what they need and then find and select non-executives. So that's about 40% of the work we do, and so that's quite a significant part of my team's world is talking to people who might want to be non-executives and helping trust to encourage the right ones forward.
I mean, you might be humble, but I am still going to call you the Ned Guru, because you are one. So for anyone who doesn't actually know what a non-executive director is, Robin, I'm going to come back to you in the first instance and ask the question, what on earth is a non-executive director?
So there are two answers to that, I think. One is a legal one, which is that in UK law, they are just a director. You are jointly and severally responsible for the performance of your organisation. The other half of that, though, is that you play a very, very important role as part of, certainly in a lot of the United Kingdom's boards, and the NHS has grasped it with both hands in a unitary board model. You're part of a team. So you are on a team that has got different responsibilities. And I think the non-executive bit is to provide support, and that can be through challenge or encouragement, to the executive who are doing all the delivery in terms of setting strategy and holding the organisation to the performance of the organisation to account for meeting its obligations. So it's a fascinating role. It's not a full-time role. It's a fascinating role. But it does have some distinctions. They are not in law; they are in behaviours and I suppose they're probably in how people have got the role working. So the unitary model has developed over the years, and that's perhaps a phrase to come back to. So that's, to my mind,
Yeah,
what
and
a
I am going to
non-executive
come
is.
back to the whole what on earth is a unitary board bit. Before I do, though, I think what you described really, really well is that a non-executive director is that critical friend. So they're part of the board, they understand and support the work of the organisation, but they're there to provide a slightly different perspective, a little bit of a fresh pair of eyes, but also to hold the mirror up. So it's quite a skill set that you need to be able to hold your own in a boardroom and to be able to do that. But as Cathy's alluded to, you don't necessarily need to be from the NHS to do so. Now, Cathy, as chair of the ICB, you work with independent non-executive members who are kind of like non-executives, but slightly different. Can you just clarify a little bit about the difference?
So they're similar but different. So a non-exec in a provider trust, take a hospital, a classic teaching hospital, would be looking at data analysis, information on the performance of that trust, the financial management, the risk management of that particular organisation and service. What's different when you get to system level, and this is something we've been working with GatenbySanderson on, is enabling people to understand the different non-exec roles in the NHS, because you're not just coming to be part of the NHS. It's enormous, it's complex, isn't it? And at a system level on an ICB, an integrated care board, you're looking more across a whole system. You're looking for flashpoints around areas of concerns and things that might be being escalated to you by a place. We have 5 distinct places in West Yorkshire. And those populations are being served, or anything from 200, 300,000 up to 700, 800,000 population. And also the good practice. And that's one of our jobs, I believe, in the ICB, is to go and find the best practice, identify it, celebrate it, and make sure that is being exchanged across. So we're 18 months, 2 years into being an ICB now, aren't we? We're learning along the way. We're taking lots of good practice from provider boards, but also we're taking forward our ways of working. And what our chief exec would call, sometimes we're Whitehall in the region, sometimes we're the broker and the convener, and therefore that's a different style of role. What I would say of any non-exec role, you are not there to mark the homework of the executives. That is not helpful in any way. We have executives here who may have been on the end of that. You're there, as you say, Fatima, to be a critical friend and to enable the organisation to improve and develop.
In essence, you're there to make the organisation the best it can be. And sometimes that requires you to constructively challenge with love, as I like to say, or, you know, to be that broker, convener, influencer to support the executives to deliver the mission of the organisation, which in our case as a health and care system is the best services possible for the diverse communities of West Yorkshire. There's another element when it comes to working with NHS organisations, and that's the role of governors. And depending on what organisation you work in, governors are significantly involved in the appointment process. And Marie, as an organisation that's got a really thriving governor community, I know because I used to work with them. Can you explain to a layperson what a governor is and how they're involved with the appointment of a NED?
Yeah, excuse me, they're a really important role in a trust, to be honest with you. Governors are not salaried jobs. They are volunteers, they come from different backgrounds, so they represent their areas. The staff governors of different groups as well. So I always believe when you get a good governing body, it's because they're doing it for the right reasons. It's not because of finance, it's because they want to do it. So governors are volunteers in many ways, as I've described them. Excuse me. The most important thing I think about a governor is what you don't want on a board is a wild chair or a board of non-exec directors who think they can do what they want, or a chief exec. Governors are that real conscience of our local community. They basically, they're basically, as a chair of a trust, which I am, my governing body will make sure my objectives are right. They will challenge, they appoint me, they appoint non-exec directors, they approve the salary of the whole board, do governors, and they're very powerful in determining fairness, equity, and more important, that level of assurance. I love my governing body. I'm very fortunate. I've got a very good relationship with it, but it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time. And to be fair, they ask some of what I would say are the most basic questions, but they are probably the truest questions of the lot. And I think it's a real privilege to work with governors. I also think it's a massive level of assurance to a board, a governor is. So yeah, that's the role of a governor. And as a chair of a trust, you know, the foundation trusts don't have a board of governors. I think all trusts should have them, because I think they bring that semblance of local community as well as a massive level of assurance for the right reasons.
It's that level of grassroots engagement, isn't it, and ownership across all levels of the organisation to the board that I think governors add real value to. But I also think it's a really influential role that people don't fully appreciate, being a governor. I don't think we sell it well enough, and I don't think we also sell it as a stepping stone potentially to becoming a non-executive, because if you work as a governor, you kind of understand some of the machinations that you would need to be a non-exec director. And I don't think we've done that sell, have we, Marie? Do you think it's a good stepping stone as a chair?
I think it's really good. We have what we call a members' council, which is effectively a board in its own right. It works with the chair and the executive colleagues as well. And I think it's an amazing stepping stone into understanding the functioning of what boards do, what decisions are made, and the complexity of the NHS and other partner organisations like the voluntary private sector as well that we all deal with. So it's a great stepping stone to be a governor. I also think you learn about board etiquette.
Yes.
Because there's ways of asking things and ways of not asking things and getting the best out of people. And I think, you know, I think it's a great way of understanding that, actually. So I'd encourage anybody, if you've got a local trust in your local area, you want to be a non-exec director, get yourselves involved if you can in being a governor to start with. It's a super way of getting into understanding a very complex system.
And you mentioned the non-verbal etiquette, which we are going to come back to as part of our journey of knowing what to become and how to become a NED. Farah, you're the embodiment of a slightly different journey, aren't you? Because obviously your day job is that you work as a clinical leader, but you're obviously a non-executive director. How did that happen? And is it something that adds value, or is it a challenge?
So 100% adds value, and it happened with purpose. Actually, I have a background in trade union, and I was quite involved previously. For about sort of 10 years, just over 10 years working with the trade union. That activism background was always inbuilt in me. And I knew that to take it to the next level, I really needed to be able to influence or be in a position to influence development of strategy and create impact for our communities at a much bigger level. But these cycles are 3-5 years ahead of us. So whilst the activism bit is dealing with the here and now, sometimes the strategy is being set elsewhere. And so it was very much a purposeful choice and decision that there is an area that is untapped here, and to go and sort of stretch myself, but to contribute to my community. So I'm actually a NED in the community I work in the community I live in, and also within mental health, which is the vast majority of what we are seeing in daily general practice. So I'm living, breathing, influencing and developing it. So yeah, very deeply embedded in it.
No, and it's a really great example of the power of a non-executive when it comes to the elements of soft influence, right? Because we always talk about non-executives giving that independent perspective, constructive challenge, and people always assume that it's on things like audit or, you know, remuneration committees or performance, but actually it can be clinical expertise too that can add real value. So no, absolutely can see the correlation, and clearly you are making a massive impact, which the people of North London will be very grateful for. Peter, I was really conscious inviting you on the podcast because I was really keen to get the perspective of an executive in particular and the relationship of a non-executive with the executive. So I remember when I first became a non-exec, Marie was one of my first chairs, poor darling. She never got rid of me after that. And I remember really struggling with the balance of operational and strategic, and that sort of blended line between the two. So it would be great if you could share a little bit about the expectations of executives and non-executives and kind of how it works in your organisation. Big questions, I know.
Well, the NHS for the last 30 odd years, since it's had boards in organisations, has sort of been pulled in different directions, I have to say. On the one hand, it is, as I think many people understand, quite a command and control organisation. And I personally, as a chief executive, am called an accountable officer, and I can be invited to sit before the Public Accounts Committee or the Health Select Committee to explain my decisions and what goes on in the organisation. So there is that sort of command and control. But at the same time, we have unitary boards, as has been mentioned, a mixture of executive directors and non-executive directors. So typically, the executive directors will be the chief executive, the director of finance, the medical director, chief nurse, and possibly an operations director or an HR director. And they sit alongside, technically, as equal members of the board with the non-executive directors. But who appoints these executive directors? Well, it's the non-executive directors. And who appraises the executive directors? Well, it's the non-executive directors again. So there is this sort of real mixture of accountability straight through to Parliament and command and control, and to the Secretary of State for Health. And yet within the board, we're meant to be all equals, and yet there is that sort of slight hierarchy in terms of appointment and appraisal. And this plays out in different ways, I have to say. And as I said in my introduction, I've had the good fortune to work with several dozen non-executives over my career, with a huge range of backgrounds. Some have run huge private companies, British Shoe Corporation, Pilkington Glass, etc. Some have been top civil servants, some have been academics, journalists, quite a number have been clinicians, and quite a number have come from the voluntary sector. And I have to say that range of experiences has been hugely valuable to me as an executive. And the interplay between the execs and the non-execs can usually be very, very constructive. Those different perspectives, those different experiences and career backgrounds allow non-executives to raise questions with people like myself. My career has been exclusively in the health service, and challenge us as critical friends and say, have you thought of this? Why don't you do that? Equally, I have learnt over many years through really good experiences, and I encourage my executive directors to do this. I deliberately go to non-executive directors and say, there's a problem here I'm struggling with, or we're struggling with. Can you help us? You know, how would you have dealt with it in your previous experience? Or can you just offer wise words and help us steer through that? And that can range from the very operational, and I'll be honest, at the moment, I'm working very closely with a non-executive director of my organisation, handling a rather complex human resources and patient safety issue. Very operational. Or it can be strategic. How does the organisation develop? And you know, do we invest in this service? Do we disinvest in that? All these big strategic issues, and often people from the private sector come in with far more experience, and it's terribly helpful to people like me. But also it's about understanding what the public, who we are here to serve, needs. And that's again where non-executive directors are hugely helpful to people like myself, because they come along and they challenge us. And that's not just challenging lay managers like me, it's challenging the medical director or the chief nurse and say, well, actually, from a patient point of view, have you thought of this? Or from a public accountability point of view, the local community in Yorkshire wants this from Yorkshire Ambulance Service. Have you thought of that? So there's a variety of different ways in which these things play out. At the heart of it is good relationships. working closely with people, trusting people, and respecting people. Because, as I say, the architecture of it, if you think about the command and control and the who appoints and so on, it is an odd system. But I have to say, my experience is it usually works. If the relationships are good, it can work superbly.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Relationships can take, weeks, sometimes years to create, but can be decimated in a matter of seconds, which is why it's so important that we invest and work on it. One of the things that you said that really struck me, Peter, was the range of skills that you need around a board. The different insights, the different perspectives, the different sectorial perspective, etc. When you're thinking about, and I'm mindful that you said you're not always directly involved with the recruitment process, but when people are thinking about non-executive recruitment, do they normally consider a specific skill set or gap within the board that they're particularly interested? Is that something, I mean, Marie and Cathy are nodding, but going to you in the first instance, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, all boards are required to identify what skills do they think they need across the board, what are skills and experiences. And most boards do this systematically, and they actually ask each board member, do you think you're skilled in this or that or the other? And then they identify gaps and may decide, right, we need a clinician. Oh, we need someone from a particular background, but perhaps particular from a minority ethnic background or someone with a disability, or we need more business experience, and so on. And so quite often when you see non-executive director advertisements, they will say, for this particular role, we are particularly encouraging someone with background X, background Y, or whatever. Latterly in the NHS, I have to say, there's been much more consciousness of the importance of us representing the wide range of backgrounds that people in our communities have. And so there's a much stronger focus on people which, under the Equality Act, are called protected characteristics, whether it's gender or ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and so on, to try to make sure that the board isn't what historically, when I joined the health service many years ago, boards were almost exclusively middle-aged white men. And to be gay in that environment was unacceptable, and people with other protected characteristics usually didn't have any opportunities. Thankfully, that position has moved on, although the NHS still has a lot further to go.
I mean, we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about positive action, which is what you've alluded to. But you've triggered a couple of thoughts I wanted to come to Cathy and Marie on. I'm going to come to Marie first, particularly about the skills and attributes, because Marie, you've worked in both a hospital trust, an acute hospital trust, and now obviously you're actively working within a mental health trust. And it is a very random question, but Fatima loves to ask these, which is, do you need different attributes if you are a NED at an acute trust than you would do if you were a NED at a mental health trust? And then I'm going to ask the same of Cathy of an ICB.
Good question. Having worked in all areas, I think they attract different types of people. I think it's very much on what the person themselves feel their contribution can offer most to. For example, there are what we call system jobs. So like Cathy's role of the ICB chair is a system job. Cathy described that earlier. My job is in a trust. My job is therefore as a providing organisation. So the first thing you need to ask yourself, do I want to work across a system, or do I actually want to work in a trust? The next question is say, well, what kind of trust do I want to work in? What kind of trusts are there? Well, we've got acute trusts, which is your usual district general hospitals or teaching hospitals. We've then got mental health and community trusts. Excuse me, mental health trusts, for example, have forensic services as well, which is part of the judicial system. So the best thing to do is to have a look at the different type of trusts in your area, decide what it is you yourself actually like the look of and you think you can contribute more to, because it is about what you want to do and what you can offer. The other thing I would say, to adding to what Peter said, there are certain skills as well you might want to consider. So a skill you may want, for example, is I've got a lawyer on my board at the moment. I've got an accountant, I've got HR specialist. I also think it depends what the gaps are on the board. And what I mean by that is, what is the board looking for moving forward? So on my board, I'm about to go out and recruit for 2 more NEDs shortly. I definitely need somebody with a clinical background to bring in that clinical challenge. I don't have that at the moment. I could do with somebody who has, you know, has worked in local communities like public health or understand diversity, inclusion, but more importantly, what those barriers are coming into hospitals, for example. So to answer the question, Fatima, I do think it depends on actually looking at yourself and deciding what you think yourself would suit your style better. If I can give you an example, acute trusts, and having been a chief exec in one for many years, they're fast paced, they're performance driven, it's episodic care, people are in and out of hospital quickly, but people actually, the general public, have more notice of them. Mental health, it's much more of a reflective style. It's more considered, it's more partnership working, because that's the way people have looked at it. So I think it does depend on you having a close look at yourself, getting some feedback about what you think you would prefer and what you think you can contribute to, because there's a vast array of skills and backgrounds, people, and I think every single body, everybody has something different to offer, and it's bringing that out in yourself and recognizing it.
And we're going to come back to maybe practical things you can do to find out a little bit more of what the organisation is looking for as part of the recruitment process. But I don't want to steal your thunder just yet. Cathy, as somebody who's worked in both, you know, Barnet District Care Trust and now the first ever chair of the NHS West Yorkshire ICB, what do you think are the differences to what Marie's just described when it comes to being a NED in a trust, for example, compared to a system role, which is the one that an INM would do in the ICB?
So, Marie, thank you for describing how you could be in a community, you could be in acute, or you could be in a mental health trust, or you could be in a combination of things. So Bradford District Care is community and mental health. The trust I was on the board of in Manchester was acute and community. So I think there's something I'd say to anyone thinking about the role. You need to, as Marie says, understand the types of services that are on offer, but also increasingly now we're working in systems and more in partnership. You may have a passion for community services, which I particularly do, but I have a passion for lots of different parts of the NHS. But you need to understand that you have to understand your neighbour and the people up the road, including the ambulance service. And the ambulance service want to work closely with both the hospitals, the acute services, as well as community services as well. So there is something, whether you're working at system or any of those types of services, you need to understand stakeholder management and partnership working, because we do not work in silo anymore. And so if that's not your bag, I'm not sure this era of the NHS might suit you. So I'd really think about how you do that partnership working, because there is a lot of give and take. And then at a system level, it is really understanding how you can work at such a scale. I mean, for West Yorkshire, our system budget is around £5.5 billion. We have not only those 3 areas of provision around acute mental health and community, but also dental, other aspects of primary care, particularly general practice. And so you have to sort of understand and turn your knowledge and your critical friendship into all those different areas. And we are also the host, the home for Yorkshire Ambulance Service across 3 systems. So you will come with your expertise. 2 of my non-execs are professors at university. One is an expert in primary care, one is an expert in digital transformation and healthcare. That's incredibly important to us, but they also need to understand other aspects as well. What I would say, going back to Marie's point, is there's something about risk management, which is a key part of being a non-exec and sitting on a board with other colleagues, is how you have that oversight of risk management. And those services Marie described have different risk management approaches. If you're working in a hospital and you're a non-exec, you can go around and do visits. You can touch the sides of those buildings and walk around those estates and sites. If you're working in community, you're working and supporting people who are district nurses, who are out and about in their cars and going into people's homes. In some ways, some people would argue are taking on a higher risk when they're delivering services. And mental health, Marie's talked about there, is a different way of working. And in mental health, people's length of stay is weeks, if not months, perhaps very sadly a year or more. Whereas, as Marie talked about, in acute hospitals, it's episodic care. So You should always come and apply for a role on a board and work in the NHS with a motivation of what you can give and what you can contribute, and how you want to make a difference. But you have to be very realistic that these are big organisations in regulated environment as well. So I always say to people applying for jobs, what is the contribution you could make? What is the best contribution you can make to this work? And as Marie says, how do you fit in with that? So we're complex yet simple, aren't we? Because we're all about giving the best care possible
that's
to
a
people.
contradiction in itself, isn't it? We're complex yet simple, folks.
We are.
I mean, the thing I would say, and I don't disagree with what anyone said, is be prepared to learn too. Because even if you are someone that has had an absolute seasoned career as an executive, you're always learning on the board. I mean, I'm always learning. I've been doing non-exec work now for, God, 10 years. And there's never been a meeting I've been in where I've not learned something. So there's something about the mindset that you need as well of not having all the answers. And Peter described beautifully the process of appreciative inquiry and the leadership where you don't need to have all the answers. So we've talked a little bit about the attributes and what people are looking for, Robin, but as the guru of recruitment, could you talk us through what is the actual practical process? How does it work? And talk me through the moment that an organisation approaches you with the vacancy, they've done the whole process of mapping what they're looking for, and then they're like, Robin, come and fix it.
Thanks. So in terms of a process, I mean, there's a bit that goes into what you've just described as the starting point. I mean, a recruitment process in many respects is really quite straightforward. I mean, in that you've got a hole that's the shape of a human being that you're trying to fill in the organisation, and you start off looking for a number of people and whittle them down. Actually, in what you're looking for, there is some. I mean, one of our roles is to just make sure that the assumptions behind we're looking for somebody who's got these characteristics, that the assumptions behind that are actually valid, and that's that they make sense for a candidate reading it and they make sense for the marketplace. But assuming that's all gone well, there are then probably 3 stages, that bit preparation being done. You're then left with what in my language would be a period of search, so attracting candidates, and a period of selection, which has got stages to it. So as a candidate looking from the outside, the role will be available because this is a public appointment, so it will be visible. A lot of private sector ones are not, but it will be visible, and there'll be an awful lot of information for you to look at, and you absolutely should absorb that because it's there for a reason, and that's to be read.
So can we pause there for 1 minute, Robin, before you move on to the next stage? Because a question that lots of people ask me when they want to start the non-exec journey is, where are you looking?
Yeah,
where are you advertising?
So
we want to know.
So there are a number of places. There is a public appointments website which is worth googling, and that comes up very easily. There are also we mentioned about being being a governor or whatever. These are the NHS is comprised of essentially a federation of sort of towns and villages essentially, and you will be local to a trust. And actually we haven't mentioned this, but I think quite rightly, the NHS is normally very keen that people who apply to be a non-executive are doing so because they're in and of the community. Not always, but nearly all the case. So the first bit is work out who the NHS provider organisations are around you, and keep an eye on their website, their own websites. Plus, there are headhunters like GatenbySanderson, and there are others. And we all have websites that allow you to set up to be sent a message when something that looks right comes your way.
So on that one, if I was looking, interested, open, as they say, how do I let you know that, Robin? That I'm looking for opportunities.
You drop me a note. You drop me a note, and I and my colleagues and we'll all get the same. Get an awful lot of people saying, "Look, I'm interested in. I don't know whether I'm right," and we'll always have a conversation because why not? And actually, I have to say also, if you are, if you're living in Southwest Yorkshire or whatever, and you think I'm really intrigued by what Southwest Yorkshire Partnerships does. Sorry, Marie, but actually dropping Marie a note.
Why would you not want to work for Marie? Yeah, I mean, she's just done such a brilliant sell, hasn't she?
Yeah, but dropping Marie a note to say, look, this is my background. Am I absolutely, am I barking up the wrong tree or not? And Marie, I suspect would probably either answer you or find somebody nearby who will. Marie, I hope I'm setting you up for a fool there.
So going back to both of you, and maybe to some of the others that might want to come in, sometimes we need to be honest with individuals that don't have the right attributes, right? Because when you're putting yourself out there, and I am being very naughty where I'm comparing it to sort of a dating marriage bureau type thing, because it is a bit like you sort of putting people together, aren't you, like First Dates and other TV shows are available. But if it's not a good fit, if they're not there yet, do you tell them, Robin?
Yes, but I think it's important not to just say it's not going to work ever.
He's
I mean,
just
there
not
are
that into you.
Yeah,
Would you say that?
There are times when you do have to say that, but actually I think what's important today is, look, if it's not right now, is that stuff that is fixable, or are there other things you need to go away and do first? I mean, being an NHS non-executive director, if you look at the non-executive roles as a sort of a ladder you can climb, a non-executive director in the NHS is a couple of rungs up that ladder, because even the small NHS organisations are very big, and the system is incredibly complex, which is why the jobs are so intellectually stimulating. But the large trusts are, are 2 or 3 billion pounds of turnover and employ tens of thousands of staff. And it's no good having non-executive directors who have no idea about how that's going to work. So to get to be a non-executive, even in a smaller NHS trust, which is still going to be hundreds of millions of pounds of turnover, you may not always be able to go straight onto that rung of the ladder. It may help to have gone somewhere else first, and that's part of the conversation. Say, I'm looking at your CV and talking to you. I actually think you'd really benefit from a year or two in a housing association or a charity or here or there, and then come to the NHS, proving that you know how to be a non-executive. You've done the trustee non-executive bit.
So
sometimes
even if you're not there yet, it's still possible. As the story that you're saying, Robin.
But actually, and I'm going to quote Peter's chair, actually, who said this phrase to me once, which is, but there are times when you just have to say, look, not everybody has a right to be a non-executive director.
Absolutely.
And you do have to have that honest conversation sometimes.
Yeah, but it's like any recruitment process, isn't it? Where you put yourself out there is always going to be that risk that you're not the right fit, and that's okay. It's just not the right opportunity for you. Cathy, you look like you wanted to come in. Was there something you wanted to share? I mean, you and I have been involved in many recruitment processes, haven't we? So you might want to reflect on that.
Yeah, so one thing I'd say to anyone listening is thinking about applying for a role. I think the NHS is becoming more and more open-minded to the kind of people that they want to take onto a board. And Peter shared earlier about what boards looked like a good while ago, and they are changing a lot, and that's good. And one of the commitments we've got particularly is to make sure our board membership is reflective of the communities that we serve, and we want diversity in thinking and representation. What I would say to people is the point that Robin was just making. Most NHS trusts are the size of a FTSE 300 or a FTSE 100 company. The scale of them is enormous, the regulation that sits around that. And I don't want to put people off, but if that does put you off, then think about something else maybe. In terms of transferable skills, when I've been doing recruitment as a trust chair, and Fatima, you helped me in setting up the Integrated Care Board with Rob, our chief exec, and others. We could look at transferable skills. So Robin's talking there about being on the board of a housing association or a large scale charity. I think those kind of transferable skills are really helpful, particularly if you can show how you can make that crossover or that step up because of the scale and the complexity. However, there's loads of entry level points. Marie talked earlier about becoming a member of your local trust, becoming a governor on the Council of Governors. There are also things that we've introduced over recent years in the NHS around the Next Director scheme, which NEXT, run by NHS England, where you need a sponsor like me or Marie as a chair to say, come and join us, come and get experience basically and observe. There is also associate non-exec roles as well, where expertise and it's a development opportunity. Many of them are remunerated, which gives you a great exposure to board and a sort of a level of experience as a non-exec. And then Gatenby run the Insights programme as well, which we in West Yorkshire have signed up to as a collective group of 11 providers and AICB. So there's loads of entry levels, and sometimes it's better to go and do something like that to cut your teeth and get that understanding. There's so much jargon in the NHS. If you ever look at a set of board papers in the NHS, the amount of pages of just translating the jargon. I mean, I remember becoming a NED for the first time and reading that really avidly to try and get my head around it. But now what you have to do at a meeting is go, excuse me, could you translate that, please? Because sometimes one piece of jargon or one analogy actually means 3 different things, and you must clarify, and there's no shame in that whatsoever. So I'd explore different things. And I suppose my last point on this, Fatima, as you know, because we are public bodies and because we are public servants, Most of our board documentation and our board meetings are available online. You can also come and sit physically in and watch a board meeting, or you can watch ours online, where NHS West Yorkshire ones, you can watch them on live broadcast or on record. So there's a way in which you can literally sit at your desk at home if you or listen to find out more about how the board works. So I'd encourage people to do their research and get to know people, as was said earlier. Approach someone like Marie with the new two non-exec vacancies coming up. It's absolutely fine. I know that's not the done thing in other sectors, but that is really welcomed in the NHS.
Well, we're going to come back to that in a bit, so hold that thought. The other thing is, while you're watching the board meetings, do what I do, which is the ironing. So I am sad enough to watch the NHS England board while doing my ironing, because it's just good to know what's going on, and you understand lots of things in the background. My children think I'm very sad, but I think I'm just on my A game. Coming back to you, Robin, we obviously talked about the search part of the recruitment process. Talk me through the long list, the short list, the mock interview bit that you do as part of the sifting through process.
Yeah.
And while you're doing that, share a little bit of the golden nuggets of what is Robin looking for to make that all-important shortlist.
Thanks. Well, and Fatima, because what I and the team are looking for is actually what at the final interviews makes everybody go, great, we've got a wonderful choice here, and it is working backwards from that, and that will feel very different between organisations and actually between different times for organisations in terms of what they're looking for. In terms of the process, because this is the public sector, it is an auditable process. It's got clear gateways, and and then somebody at the end can challenge it. You can look back and say, this is what happened here. I mention that because if one's coming out of the private sector, and in the long distance past I recruited in there, it's not always as clear cut. But it is in the public sector and in the NHS. So you will go through a process. There will be about a month of looking for candidates, attracting candidates, and there are a number of ways in which they'll be approached. We'll be approaching people, but it will be advertising. Sometimes there'll be a webinar like this to hear the organisation talk about itself. But at some point, there is a closing date, and that's when the search bit stops, and you're either a candidate or you're not. As you said, there's then a long listing and a short listing process, and that is the hopper I described before of starting with a group of candidates. So you've applied, probably with a CV and a covering letter. That is assessed purely on the basis of the paperwork. In other words, what did the person's specification look for, and how do you meet that? Therefore, if you're applying with a covering letter, it's a really good idea to make sure that you've covered off the experience criteria in the support in your supporting statement.
You'd think that was really obvious, wouldn't you? But I have been on many appointment processes where I'm reading a letter and I'm not quite sure what they've seen the person's like. So that's a top tip. I would follow that one, Robin.
It's definitely good to do that. And to do that, it's probably helped because you will have absorbed an awful lot of the information that the board's provided. And as Cathy mentioned, it's all in the public domain. And there's a caveat in there. It's in the public domain. So it really, really is a bad idea to ignore it, because people will assume you've read it and will wonder why you haven't bothered. So that's
and I get
really
really cross if I'm in an interview panel, and Cathy will attest to this, and will Marie, to be fair, because we've been on ones together, where if you've not read the strategy or you don't refer to the strategy as part of that recruitment process, either in your covering letter or the interview, Fatima gets quite grumpy.
Yeah, well, and it's because of the grumpiness of the final panel that, and this is not a trade secret at all, but the first question I'll ask at a preliminary interview is, tell me about the organisation. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And I can promise you find out very quickly whether somebody's read something or not.
Yes.
But so that sift of the applications is done as a paper exercise. And from that, there is then a conversation with the trust. So it is the trust's decision about who do we take forward, probably to a preliminary interview, which would be if using GatenbySanderson with us. So there'll be a sift, therefore, that reduces the numbers to a certain number of people, and you'll be invited in, probably on Teams, to have an hour or so's conversation with somebody like myself. And I've already said what the first question is. And actually, by that stage, you do need to know pretty much why you're interested, what it's all about. You may well have some questions, but you can't go into that thinking, I can't wait to go to this interview because then they'll tell me what this is all about. It's a bit late by then. And again, in the private sector, where quite often you'll apply for a role not knowing the organisation that you're coming into or the details. You certainly won't have read their strategy because that's commercially confidential. You know, there's a mindset in the private sector which is, as we go through the process, we both sides reveal a bit more about ourselves, and you know, so I'll tell you about me, you tell me about you. That doesn't work in a public sector process. So at that preliminary interview, that's what that's about. Now, the preliminary interview will be looking at what have you done. So tell me about your skills and your experience, and I'll get some sense about your style. It may go into a little bit about what will you do. You know, if you're in this role, what will you do? But I'd argue that the final interview panel is likely to do much more of the what will you do. So tell us how you would approach this. So you need to be prepared to talk about all aspects of the person's specification, your style, your motivation for the role, and also get into some housekeeping issues about, you know, where do you live? Do you really have the time commitment to give? You know, what is 2, 3, 4 days a month? All of that will be covered in that first stage. And that's when you then get to another meeting with the trust, which I'll be going on. I would go to the shortlist meeting, and that's where the trust chooses who are the possibly 3 or 4 people that will invite into the final interviews.
That is so helpful, Robin, because I think a lot of people do not understand how it works. And there are some top tips in there that I think people really need to be mindful of. One is always do your homework. Never turn up to a meeting with Robin unprepared is the first takeaway. Second one is if you're applying for an organisation, maybe Google it and have a look at what it's there for, what its strategic vision is, and what it's aspiring to do. But I think an equal point is, what are you bringing? And I think people don't always consider that as part of it, because it's a two-way process. You know, we're feeling each other both out and to see if it's the right fit. So there is something about, well, what attributes are you bringing and how can you demonstrate that through examples? Because you've got to remember that, you know, we don't know each other. So if I was meeting you for the first time, Robin, and I'm sure you still have nightmares about that, I need to give you examples of, you know, the things that I've done and back up what I'm saying with practical evidence of the things that I've achieved. But Farah, as somebody who has survived a non-executive recruitment process, not with Robin, shall I say, because Robin's lovely, I'm just joking. What are your reflections on what you've just heard Robin say? Have you got anything additional that you wanted to add? And then the third part of my question, as a lady who has a full-time job, has little people in her life, how do you balance it? Is it feasible? Is it possible? Because some people ask me that question a lot.
Well, everything's possible. You've got to have the mindset to make it possible. And you've got to construct the week that you want to work and be very clear about your boundaries. So I think that becomes important, but I'll come back to that a bit later. So you'll be glad to know, Robin, that I followed all of that advice, which is why I was recruited in the first place. But I think preparation is really key. And you're right, Fatima, I'd sat in interviews on panels and seen how colleagues I know have done the work, but just haven't presented themselves. And I think there's something in there about our interview process, because are we weeding out perfectly good candidates because they aren't able to present themselves on the day? That's something we do need to think about, but I think preparation is absolutely key. Read the board papers, so important. I mean, come on, don't apply to a board and don't read the papers. You know, I've gone back a year's worth of papers. I've watched videos of meetings, you know, because there's something in there about the foreseeable future and strategy that people are thinking about. And this is really important. The other thing I'd be interested to hear what the panel here thinks. The soft bit, speaking to people already working, but also speaking to partners in the system can sometimes also be really insightful. So I did a little bit of that, not a lot, but I think going into the future, if I was to keep doing this, I would probably do a bit more of that. So you understand, because especially now the system is working much more collaboratively together. And I think appreciating the direction of travel, understanding what's next on the horizon can be very useful, because you might not want to be part of that journey and upheaval. And it will help you make a decision. So anyway, hopefully I've answered why I got recruited.
You have, absolutely.
Bang on there. But little people know. look, in life, I think any job with little people becomes possible because of the support of many, and because of being very clear about what resources you need, what support you need. And that becomes true even in an ed role. So there will be times when I might not be able to make the overnight of a board strategy away day because I've got little people at home, and just being very clear about the why, but then maybe dipping in and out, so doing the dinner, doing the breakfast, running home. It's a juggle. I'm not alone. I've got a really supportive partner, my husband, and these things then become possible. Equally with work, I think being a GP, I'm able to structure my working week in a way that allows me the flexibility to dip in and out. So I'm quite lucky in that respect. But it's by design. I've designed and crafted that working week, and others will be able to do so as well. And I know colleagues who've been working in trusts where the trust values that sort of development opportunity, and also the learning that you get from being on another board that you can then bring into the organization. So I suspect it's about mindset, about where you're working and their approach. And if your company is saying no, there's no space for this, you might even want to think, is that a company you want to carry on working with? If you've got if you know you want to grow in different ways and apply yourself to different careers, etc., to more seniority in your career, and not being stuck just at that clinician level day to day. So I think it's very, very possible. You just have to articulate it very clearly. Yeah.
And, you know, we've done a whole podcast on work-life blend and the art of the possible being women, with Tracy Braben, our mayor, and Alison Moe, our deputy mayor. So you can look back at that previous podcast and explore some of the practical issues that you've just alluded to, Farah. But what I would say is, and I'm not just saying this because I love you, you are probably a very courageous woman, and you're a lady who can talk about what it is that she wants and can assert boundaries. You make it sound really easy. In practice, it's quite hard.
Yeah.
But your role modelling, I'm sure, will inspire others to do the same, because we have to change the status quo. If we want diversity in all its sense in our boardrooms, then we've got to recognise that both men and women need to work differently, don't we? Because it's not just women that have the caring responsibilities, men do too.
Yes, you're 100% right. And perhaps I just take it for granted because I've been doing it for so long. But I am the mother who showed up at conferences, you know, carrying or pushing a pram and carrying a baby. And I've done it. I've chaired
And I bet
a panel.
you weren't short of babysitters either.
You know, I've chaired a panel where I had my youngest is now 14 months. So I chaired a panel and the baby was in the room nearby. And I just asked, I want to do it. Would this be acceptable? And of course of course it is. But yeah, we don't see it enough. So you're quite right. And there is something in there about how we are positioning ourselves to be a board that is welcoming of parents of young children, and appreciate, or also for that matter, carers, you know, because there are responsibilities that fall outside of the 9 to 5 within a board role, and it's not always deemed as a possible role to do if you've got all these different pulls on your time. So there's something in how we're designing our working ways on a board, and being supportive of colleagues with various responsibilities, recognizing their time pressures, and responsibilities.
And I think there's also another practical element of people on boards being role models within their organisation. So I remember tweeting my first ever ICB board, where I turned up in Saw Archimedes, and I remember texting Cathy going, do you mind? Do you mind? She's like, why would I mind? And I had a prayer room when I prayed twice during the board meeting. And the thing that struck me the most was it wasn't a big deal. Like, I thought it was a big deal. They were like, "It's what it is. Oh, you look nice." And I think there's something about how there's two things from what you described, Farah. One is, if you don't ask, you don't get.
Yeah.
But two, role modeling the art of the possible then empowers others to see what they can do too. So you make it sound really easy, and you're being very humble about it, but you're fabulous and a role model to others, and we're very grateful that you shared that with us today. But going back to the situation, sorry,
Fatima,
go on.
I might just share one specific point, because this is something for us to all think about as boards. So I actually went on to have a baby within my NED role, right?
Yeah.
And actually I hadn't quite appreciated I'd have to to stop and step away for a short while. And there is something about, I would have quite liked to have carried on, but we were meeting in person and I was breastfeeding and it was a bit, you know, all over the place. So if I was to design that differently, and I have done it. I've done it in a contract negotiation cycle in a previous role, in my executive trade union role, where I went back to work 1 month breastfeeding a kid with a pup. You know, I was able to do it because we designed it, but I didn't feel able to. So despite being so outspoken and vocal and assertive, I didn't feel able to ask to pause a public board meeting and be able to manage my mothering responsibilities, you know. So there's something in that. I don't know the answer to that. We don't see it that frequent. We don't see a lot of young parents of young children on boards as NEDs, but we will maybe see them as executive colleagues, and they might not want to have the full year out. They might want to come back in 3 or 6 months. So how are we showcasing ourselves to be open to pausing our board meetings and accommodating of various needs?
And I think that's something we could possibly explore on a different podcast. I think one of the things that you did mention, and I think is really important to acknowledge, is probably the influence of your trade union background. So we have done another podcast on the power of trade unions. Again, you can see it in our back catalogue. But the reason why I think that is really important is because people don't always fully appreciate what they can and they can't have, what the parameters are, and also how they can negotiate to get a consensus that is mutually beneficial. Because what you're arguing, quite right, is as a non-executive, you don't want to tarnish the operational capacity of the board. The board has still got to operate irrespective of your personal circumstances. But what you'd like is some flexibility to be able to balance both, because your contributions would add value. So there's something about, well, how do we start to explore that? And that could be stuff we do through our Women of West Yorkshire work or in continuous conversations. But until we normalise this, it is going to be a lot harder. We're going to go back, though, to the journey of recruitment. And I'm going to come to Marie. And my scenario for you, Marie, is I've had the conversation with Robin and I've passed. I've made the shortlist and I really want to be a Ned in your trust, really, really want to be a Ned in your trust. What am I supposed to do to get on your good side before even the interview begins? What would you expect me to do?
On my good side. All my sides are good, Fatima.
Beautiful, beautiful.
I think the most important thing about the NHS, I think Robin alluded to it earlier. In the NHS, I would be disappointed if somebody didn't pick up the phone and have a conversation with me. It's lovely to talk to people, and it happens regularly. If they're thinking about applying for the job, they've got through this process, I would encourage anybody to pick up the phone to the chair. The reason why I would do that is, number one, I get to know them better informally. There may be things they want to ask me that they wouldn't normally ask through that kind of obvious recruitment process. Exactly what we just talked about. You know, I'm a young woman, I've got children, etc. I also think it's an important opportunity for that person to decide whether I'm somebody they'd like to work with as well, because it goes both ways, doesn't it? You know, I've got to be somebody that they would think, yeah, that would be great to work with Marie as a chair, I think, and ask, you know, encourage them to ask me what I'm like, what's the board like, what would my expectations be of them as a non-exec director. So that will be the process for me. You know, they've gone through the shortlisted in that sense, or long listed usually is the case, and then get the opportunity to pick up the phone and have a chat with the chair.
And that's
I've always done
people, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Marie, but I was just going to say that's something that people are often uncomfortable about because they feel like they're breaking the rules, and you know they shouldn't approach the chair of a panel before recruitment because it might unduly influence the outcome. So I think, you know, your first top tip of picking up the phone, reaching out and having a conversation with you about some of the areas that you described is important. But who else?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, of course, they can talk to other non-exec directors on there. They can speak to governors. You know, if you go onto a trust website, they're all listed. You could even talk to the chief exec of the organisation if you want. It is literally an open door. Yes, what will happen? Usually, companies like GatenbySanderson will give people a list of the people they might want to ring prior to their interview or whatever. You definitely ring those people on that list. I'm always disappointed when we get to interview stage and, oh no, I haven't rang them because they felt intimidated or shy, and I have to say they're not doing themselves any favours really. My advice would be, please ring the people on the list that your recruitment company are offering to start with, and then, you know, set the feelers out, you know, get some patient views. You might even be a patient user yourself, you know, it's that kind of thing, but definitely take the opportunity for those informal conversations prior to interview.
Can I come to your board and watch your board? Would that be all right?
Certainly any public board meeting, I'd definitely encourage you to watch. Similarly, you know, there'll be other meetings going on within the trust, observe them. Take a look at the website, there's loads on there as well. There's some patient stories, for example, giving your insight, the kind of care we deliver. So, you know, like Robin said earlier, do your homework, have a look at it, get to know your trust, get a feel for it. And more importantly, make sure that organisations' values and principles and behaviours suits you. Because, you know, my organisation, you know, as I've always said, I'm very proud of my trust, but it is very values driven. If your values match that, fantastic. You know, you'd enjoy being part of it, I'm sure. But yeah, take every opportunity to do that. And in my trust, Fatima, you know, ring anybody. You know, the more work you do yourself, the better. But the one thing I would say is look at yourself. What is it you're bringing? What are you offering? I know we talked about them big statutory bodies. They are big, scary places. But like we said earlier, there's ways of getting in. I appointed non-executive director a couple of years ago, never been one. He was a bit of a wild card, as I called him. And he's great, you know, 2 years down the line, he's fully supported, he's developed, he's been on the NHS provided development programme, you know, and he's a Ned now and for the future. And he's a guy in his 30s. His wife's just had a baby. Fantastic, you know.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that Farah alluded to as well, which I think you'd support, is being part of a system. Speak to other leaders within the system as well to learn a bit about the organisation from a slightly different perspective. And thinking about system perspectives, Cathy, I mean, obviously you and I have shared on this podcast about the processes that we've undertaken for non-executive leadership on the ICB board. And there was something that you did that was quite courageous, I thought, which was the process that you undertook to ensure that you had the diverse leadership you were looking for. Can you share a little bit about that and also weave in some of the attributes that you're looking for specifically for an INEM?
Yeah, so when people may be aware that there are 42 systems in England, and they are, the commissioning body for that is the Integrated Care Board, and they were set up under the Health and Care Act in 2022. And I'll stop there, otherwise I'll give you a whole history lesson. But what we had to do in early 2022 was set up the ICB. We were lucky in West Yorkshire that we had a really well-established partnership and a way of working. But we still need to set up a brand new statutory body. And we began in recruitment mode. And there was a real pace to it. We had to recruit all 24 people on that board, including senior leaders, to then create their own teams as well, bringing in the former clinical commissioning groups. And if we'd carried on at that pace, we wouldn't quite have got the result that I really wanted, because we still need to follow what we all do, because we're public servants and these are public bodies, to have people making decisions on that board who are representative of the communities in which we serve. And particularly through our non-exec director recruitment for West Yorkshire ICB, we took a moment halfway through to pause, because it wasn't getting the variety of people coming forward to apply, and it was therefore not going to result in the diversity of thinking and background that we wanted. Now, at the time, I'd set up, for any governance geeks listening, a remuneration and nominations committee. We didn't need one at that point. We hadn't become a statutory body, but there were a great group of critical friends to say, pause. I don't think you're achieving what West Yorkshire is stating, that we want greater diversity in our health and care leadership. It's one of our strategic aims. And it was great. And I could see it. I felt very uncomfortable about it. Fatima was a great critical friend to me on that. And we're lucky in West Yorkshire to have a very active race equality network. And Rob, our chief exec, and I went to talk to them to say, we've got this far in the recruitment and bringing the board together. We haven't quite got it right. And that critical friendship and robust conversation that we had with people, including Fatima, enabled us to redesign the application pack and the person specification, and with the support of HR, particularly specifically say, we are inviting applications from people from ethnic minority groups, because we really value that viewpoint, that lived experience, and that diversity of thinking to come onto our board, and it resulted in the right thing. We also did a lot of work to explicitly explain the rules, some things that Robin and Marie have just talked about, and Farah sharing her experience. We explain what the rules are and applying to the NHS, which some people didn't really know. Even our colleagues in the Race Equality Network said, I didn't know you had to do that. So we thought we were being open, we thought we were being obvious in the kind of people we were looking for, and the check and challenge was really helpful to then pause and go back out again. We've still got more to do. I'm really pleased, Fatima, you feel included as a board member right from the start in setting up the board, and we're trying to provide facilities and support to lots of different people who come and make up those 24 people. We're lucky in West Yorkshire also to have a carer's passport, which our chief exec very proudly talks about. He is on extended leave at the moment because of his caring responsibilities, and we're there to support and deputise for him. So we are working to be as inclusive as possible. It's something Peter talked about earlier, that we've always got more to do. We're restless for improvement. And I suppose, Fatima, you and I find from week to week, from month to month, the more we openly talk about this, there are more challenges come our way, but we are prepared to deal with them and try and remove some of these barriers to make sure the door is widely open for lots of people to come and be part of decision making in the NHS. So yeah, real heart and head moment we had, didn't we, Fatima?
So the reason why I wanted you to share that story was not because I wanted you to big up what I'd done, but because, of course not, we were courageous. So I remember people coming to me and saying, are you telling me that there is no one in the country from an ethnically diverse background that meets that criteria? Are you serious? And that's the bit where actually sometimes it's not the individual, it's the process, which is why demystifying the process is the reason why we've got this podcast set up. And it isn't just on executives, as you've alluded to, Peter, it's about the executive leadership too, because our aspiration is to change the whole of the leadership, but we're starting with a focus on the non-exec, because that's one that's particularly mystified. We're coming to the end of our time together, and even though we've done an extended edition, we still haven't covered everything, which means we might have to come back to this. But to finish, I've got one bump question for you each, which is the final stage of the recruitment process is that scary interview moment. And sometimes it's a range of interviews. So you might have a stakeholder panel, then you might have a sort of staff panel, and then you've got a final presentation and interview. They're the kind of things that tend to happen. Obviously, they're nuanced depending on the organisation. What is the one thing that is essential the person makes sure they do in those processes? And what is the worst thing you could do as part of that process? So the one thing that someone does an interview, don't name any names because obviously we're in a public call, but they do it and you're like, oh. So I'm going to give you mine too. So the first thing, my top tip is, and it's ironic Fatima saying this, is keep your answers short and to the point. Right? Because I've got a short bandwidth, and if you don't answer the question, I'm gone. And my thing not to do is to name drop. That really just, I'm not interested. Don't name drop. I want to hear about you, not your connection to you. So they're my two. Robin, I'm coming to you first. As the guru of interviews, what are your top tips for do's and don'ts?
Thanks, Fatima. And if ever any of my team watch this, I am going to get ribbed so much for that phrase. The do is a simple one. Be yourself. Do not try to sell a version of yourself that you think will get your job, because you're buying as well as selling here. You are absolutely need to do that. So that's it. I think the don't is a sort of a caution, and that's just watch your sense of humour. If you have friends who sort of say, yeah, you just, listen to them. If you sometimes don't quite land it, just be really careful, because that normally comes out in a moment of nervousness or stress. Yes. And that can land you in deeper water than you realised.
Farah, what are your top tips to do and don't?
So I think I'm going to follow very much what Robin was saying there. I think it's really important to be honest. You have to come over as honest. And if you're presenting this inaccurate version or you're trying to be something else, the panel will see right through it. So just be yourself. And then this is something I've had to do a few times now. If you're not answering the question, a kind panel and most of us are kind panels, they will try and bring you back to the question. So notice it. Be conscious about noticing it and acknowledge it, and then answer the question. And if you don't have an answer, say, I don't have an answer, but don't waffle and don't try to make it up.
Thank you for that. Now, Peter, you've had 30 years of sitting in interviews. So if anybody knows what to do and what not to do, it's you. What are your top tips or thoughts? And I think executive and non-executive, there's a lot of overlaps, isn't there? So you are the pro when it comes to this.
Well, nice of you to say so, but I'm still learning even at this stage of my life. But in terms of top tips, I'd say be prepared to give examples. Don't just assert I'm a compassionate person or I know how to manage budgets, but just think of one or two simple examples. They don't have to be huge, but something that gives a little bit of backup to what you're saying, but do it quickly and succinctly. And the other thing I suppose I'd say is don't go in feeling too scared. The panel want you to do well, and remember they want you to do well. They're not there to be mean to you. They actually want you to succeed. At the end of the afternoon, they want to be able to say, gosh, we've got 5 appointable candidates.
Well said about the nerves. There was one time that I went into an interview and I poured a glass of water and I was very nervous and spilt it all over the chief executive. Got the job, but it's probably not the best way to go about it. Cathy, what are your top do's and don'ts?
Oh, I've got so many, and I'm trying to be helpful when people reach out to me to say, I'm interested in this job. I've even written my own top tips now. I've been emailing to people if they approach me. What I would say is work out why you want the job, because usually the first question is, why would you like the job? What motivates you to come and join us, and why now? And it surprises me how people haven't thought that through. And also someone once said, oh, well, this is a stepping stone to the job I really want. I was like, okay, that's really interesting. The other thing I'd say is values. And if you haven't thought about your values for a while or at all, have a sit and think about it, because you also need to see how they match the organisation and the system you're coming to be part of. Interviews now are both skills and knowledge based, but they are also values based. So have a think about that. And my last one is about everyone you meet in this process is going to have some sort of contribution to the decision making. And you talked earlier, Fatima, about the stakeholder panels. I've interviewed people coming onto board roles, and they've completely dismissed meeting a patient service user group, and didn't realise that they had 30% of the scoring in the final stage. You need to treat everybody as equal. This is a public service. You need to demonstrate your humility, because this is a very democratic process. And Robin, you talked earlier about how the private sector is very different. Yes, you need to remember that everyone you're meeting is going to contribute in some way to that decision. So we're a democracy, and what we try and do, particularly in West Yorkshire.
Thank you, Cathy. And I might want to ask you to share those top tips, because they'll be gold dust, I'm sure. Saving the best till last. Marie Burnham, what are your top do's and don'ts?
Well, saving me to last, I would concur with
No
what my
pressure.
colleagues have already said. You know, it's very difficult to be the last person going. I think for me, there's a couple of things, if I may. You definitely need to respect the panel. I would do your homework on who those panel members are, so you know a bit about the background, you know where they're coming from, and more importantly, the kind of questions they may or may not ask you. So try and preempt that, but understand your panel members, I would say. The one thing I wouldn't do, and I've seen it many times, don't assume the person chairing the panel, or indeed the most important person in your eyes you need to make an impact on, treat all those panel members as equals. Because often when people are answering questions, they always look at one person on a panel. Make sure you're answering the person who's asking you the question, and make sure you respect the whole panel. So don't focus on one person who you think is the most important, who's actually ultimately got the decision, because they don't have that.
That's why I saved you till last, because that's an absolute belter of one. I've seen it so many times, and it upsets people. So you do need to make sure that you're paying attention to all the panel members. On that note, I mean, it has been a bumper edition, hasn't it, folks? We've been together for quite a long time. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to do, and I suspect a follow-up podcast on executive recruitment too, if you're up for it. I just want to say a huge thank you to Robin, to Cathy, to Marie and to Peter, and particularly to Farah, joining us all the way from London for their time and contributions on this edition of Can You See Me? Please keep following and sharing your contributions either on social media or via the comments in the YouTube chat, and we will see you very soon in the next episode. Take care and thanks for watching.